Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for the participants for joining us live for this webinar. This is part of a series of educational webinars on behalf of the World Federation of Neurosurgical Societies, and especially the Young Neurosurgeons Forum. We're broadcasting live right now from Charlottesville, Virginia, at the headquarters of the Journal of Neurosurgery Publishing Group. And today I'm here with Dr. Jim Rutka, the editor-in-chief of the journal. So Dr. Rutka is not only the editor-in-chief of Journal of Neurosurgery, but he's also the head of the Department of Surgery at University of Toronto. And he's the 7th editor-in-chief here at JNS, and the first Canadian.
That's right, Faith, that's right.
So he's extremely experienced. He has over 500 publications in terms of peer-reviewed publications, book chapters, other editorials. And today he's going to be sharing with us some of, first, his experience in getting to where he is now, as well as more about how to publish in neurosurgery and especially in the JNS. So welcome, Dr. Rutka.
Thank you, Faith. Yeah, it's great to be here. On behalf of the WFNS, I've been involved in numerous committees over the years with the WFNS. I particularly like the Young Neurosurgeons Committee of the WFNS. I previously was in charge of the Neuro-Oncology Committee of the WFNS years ago, so I have a lot of fond memories of working with the WFNS, so I'm happy to be here today representing the Journal of Neurosurgery and giving you, from my perspective, what I think it takes to publish in a scientific journal like JNS.
All right. And then at the end, we'll have some time. I know some of you are writing in questions. We can, after we go through the publishing part, we can open it up for questions as well. So Dr. Rutka, how about, it'd be great if you could tell us a little bit more about kind of your path to becoming the editor-in-chief of the journal. Were you, is this a position you saw yourself in when you started? What were some of the editorial positions you had along the way, et cetera?
Yeah, well, thanks, Faith. So you don't automatically become an editor-in-chief. It takes many years of training, of practice, of being involved in scientific manuscript writing. I was very fortunate that when I started my clinical practice, I also had a research laboratory. So I was accustomed to trying to put work together in the form of papers for consideration and publication. That said, I started as a resident in 1981 at the University of Toronto, probably long before you were born, Faith. But
no comment.
But in any event, at that time, my very first publication that I can recall was a publication that occurred in the journal Neurosurgery, and it was a case report. I put it together with hospitals. The first scientific paper publication was the successful removal of an arterial venous malformation from the basal ganglia. So as you all know, the basal ganglia is a very tricky location in which to perform surgery. This particular patient had a ruptured AVM, and instead of approaching it from the Sylvian fissure side and coming at it and clipping the lenticulostriate feeders, we came at it through the hematoma cavity, and that was the kind of novel aspect of the case report. But I remember because it was my very first scientific publication.
Very cool. What would you say is a publication other than the first one that you're most proud of?
It's a tough question. It's almost like, who's your favorite child? I'm very, very fortunate to have 3 children, and I can't answer that question. But naturally, I've been very fortunate to have written papers that are in the research domain and the clinical domain. I think one in particular that had perhaps the greatest impact was a scientific publication that occurred in Nature Genetics. It was with a colleague of mine now at the Hospital for Sick Children, but who was a PhD student working in my laboratory. That's Dr. Michael Taylor. He's the individual who helped to define ultimately the subclassification system for medulloblastoma as a tumor type. And in my laboratory, when he was a PhD student, he discovered the human genetic sequence for a gene that was only known in Drosophila, and that was called suppressor of fused. And that particular gene is very important in the pathway that's known as the hedgehog signaling pathway. And so, having now found the human homologue of the fruit fly or Drosophila equivalent, we were able to show that the hedgehog signaling pathway was extremely important in medulloblastoma pathogenesis. And this then led ultimately to the subclassification of this particular pediatric brain tumor. And so I'd have to say that's one of the most impactful works that I was part of. There were so many on the clinical side. I have interest in epilepsy surgery, so I'm very proud of some of those works. I have been involved in tumors, clinical kind of tumor research, and we have a number of publications in that domain as well, and then a variety of other research papers. But as always, it's hard to pick just your top data, but I give an example of one.
Yeah. And what was you start kind of taking on that second role? Yeah,
thanks, Faith. So I guess some of my advice to the young neurosurgeons, depending on where you're practicing, is to do manuscript reviews is, you should understand, is work that's called pro bono. What that means is you're doing that for the greater good. In case you didn't know, reviewers don't get paid to review manuscripts. There's no stipend for it. It's all because this work is extremely important for the scientific field. So it's important, but it's also it can be extremely time consuming. So I probably worked for 3 or 4 years as a clinical neurosurgeon, focusing specifically on my clinical practice, and then also being involved in research before I started to do editorial board work. And when I did editorial board work, I started first with Neurosurgery as a member of the editorial board, and then I became a member of the Journal of Neurosurgery editorial board. So I was actually on both of those journals' editorial boards as a fairly young faculty member, and that was, as I recall back in those days, that was a huge endeavor, frankly. It was a lot of work. But I did it for 5-7 years for neurosurgery, and then continued to do it for the Journal of Neurosurgery. So by the time that I had, entertained the thoughts of becoming editor-in-chief, I'd already reviewed thousands and thousands of manuscripts. So I became quite good at knowing what it takes to get papers published. I also became good at recognizing what was a good paper out of the starting blocks, and also how to word things so that authors get the best information possible from the reviews that they receive for their journals.
And then making that final transition into the role that you're in presently, what are some things that surprised you about what's different about that role as editor-in-chief as opposed to just the author, reviewer, editor?
Yeah, I guess an analogy is it's finally when you leave residency and you become a faculty member. And, as a resident, you're protected by a big system of the hospital, the institution, your other faculty members when you're doing cases. And so you work under this rather large umbrella. But when you're a faculty member, finally, after being a resident, and you operate on your first patient, you realize that the buck stops with you. You have to make the decision on how to take care of that patient. And similarly with the editor-in-chief position, as a reviewer, you provide an opinion, but in fact, there are many other opinions that go into finally making the decision that whether a manuscript will be accepted or rejected. So when you become editor-in-chief, you're the buck stops with you. And I realized that you're making decisions that can make authors extremely happy or extremely upset. And so the transition into that role, thankfully, I had a lot of experience in manuscript preparation and review of manuscripts, that it wasn't that hard a transition, but it does come with an extreme degree of responsibility. The editor-in-chief position of any journal is an important one, and a journal's reputation rests on what the editor-in-chief decides to publish based on the reviewer's comments and the types of manuscripts that get submitted to the journal.
Very good. Before we transition to, we have a short PowerPoint video about publishing in the Journal of Neurosurgery. But for JNS, what would you say, what are some changes you've made since you've been here, and kind of what is your vision for the future of the journal?
Yeah, well, thanks, Faith. So when I became editor-in-chief, one of the first things I did was I ran a strategic plan to determine what needed to be done to take us to that next level with respect to the Journal of Neurosurgery. So we did many things. They were all stepwise and incremental to a degree, but there was a lot of things that we ended up doing that I think have impacted the way that our journal is perceived worldwide. First and foremost is we definitely paid attention to the scientific content of the journal, so our impact factors have always specialty. But I would also say that we revamped the entire look of the journal, so we gave it a fresh new look on the outside. So the cover design that you see now is one that we put into place when I became editor-in-chief. I think we have some copies here, and here's an image here, for example. I get to choose the artwork for all the different journals each month, which is part of my job, among many other things. And so I'm very proud of that. But not only that, the interior components, the way that each article looks inside is something that we put into place, a brand new, fresh look for the journal overall. So that's one thing that we needed to do for sure, because that was long overdue in many respects. The other thing is that we started another new journal. It's called Neurosurgical Focus Video, and that's a new video journal that hadn't been part of our mandate previously. And we're in the midst of talking about putting another new journal into place for the Journal of Neurosurgery Publishing Group. So those are going to add on to JNS, JNS Spine, and JNS Pediatrics. And so I think those are, as I say, incremental steps in how the journal is perceived essentially around the world. We've done many other things, including the use of taking advantage of the use of social media. And for that, Faith, I want to thank you, because you're now the lead of our team of social media experts who are helping to drive traffic to the journal. So in this day and age, social media is so important, as I hope this webinar demonstrates. But thank you for your involvement in social media. I think we lead the way when it comes to impressions for social media on various sites like Facebook, like Instagram, and Twitter, for example. So we're very, very pleased and proud of that. And I think, other things that we've done is international outreach. Before I became editor-in-chief, we had no publications really in foreign languages. And since I became editor-in-chief, and based on some of the work I do in other countries around the world, like Ukraine, I do mission work in Ukraine. We've been publishing articles in Ukrainian in the Journal of Neurosurgery in Ukraine, so that they can read articles from our archive that are great because they're in their own language. And currently working on a deal with China to be able to do that. And previously we've been working with India to make collections of articles so that the Indian neurosurgeons can review what we've been doing in the Journal of Neurosurgery in their own country. So things like that, many other things, but that gives you a glimpse of some of the new trends that we're leading since I've been editor-in-chief.
Very good. All right, with that, I'm going to share my screen.
Welcome to this webinar on how to publish a scientific manuscript in the Journal of Neurosurgery. My name is Jim Rutka. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Neurosurgery. I'll be providing you with my perspectives on how to get your work published in our journal. All manuscripts that are submitted to the Journal of Neurosurgery are reviewed by an editorial board. In fact, there are 3 editorial boards, one for each of our print journals. As you can see, each editorial board is relatively small, yet they are comprised of experts in the field, and they are highly academic neurosurgeons who deliver excellent opinions about your work. The other aspect that's interesting about the Journal of Neurosurgery is its sequential review process, which I'll be speaking about in a subsequent slide. We also have an online journal known as Neurosurgical Focus, and its editor-in-chief is Dr. Marty Weiss since 1997. Neurosurgical Focus publishes monthly topical issues and has topic editors who review all of the manuscript submissions. However, the manner of submission to Neurosurgical Focus is identical to the submissions to the print journals. Now, back to sequential peer review. There's probably nothing else like it in the literature. Here are the names of some of the editorial board members and others who review manuscripts for the Journal of Neurosurgery. In this screenshot, you will see how I assign manuscripts to a primary reviewer at first, followed by a secondary reviewer who gets to see the primary reviewer's comments. If either of them is away, it would go to an alternate reviewer. If the primary and the secondary reviewer disagree with respect to the importance of the manuscript, it then goes to an arbitrator. The arbitrator delivers an opinion that then goes to the chairman of the editorial board, and the chairman will then send the manuscript to me for final deliberations. So, for example, in this screenshot, you can see a manuscript that was suggested to be revised by the primary reviewer and the secondary reviewer, but by the time the manuscript got to the chairman, it was rejected. However, all the information would come to me, and I would weigh the evidence in balance and decide whether or not this manuscript should be accepted or rejected. You can review the current submission process online at the journal. However, you should know when preparing your work that we accept clinical series, laboratory investigations, case reports, case illustrations, historical vignettes, technical notes, and literature reviews. And nowadays, we are receiving many meta-analyses for the Journal of Neurosurgery. Just a word about meta-analyses, since this is becoming quite popular. We would like you to follow certain guidelines. So, for example, you should follow the preferred reporting items for systematic reviews and meta-analyses, or the PRISMA guidelines. If you are submitting clinical trials reports, then follow the Consolidated Standards of Reporting Trials, or the CONSORT guidelines. And if you're submitting work which is in the epidemiology world, then the Strengthening the Reporting of Observational Studies in Epidemiology, or STROBE guidelines, should be adhered to before submission to the journal. As you are preparing your work for the journal, please remember that your manuscript should be written clearly and concisely. In addition, it should be logical and consistent. Finally, the data should be convincing. It is extremely important that you write well in your manuscript, because even the most novel and well-constructed study will be rejected if the writing is flawed. If the reviewers are struggling trying to determine what it is that your data mean, then there's a good chance that your manuscript will be rejected. Hence, write clearly and coherently. When sitting down to write, here is my suggestion. Begin with the results. The results are comprised of the data and your figures and the information that will then help you lead your discussion. It is in fact the results section that tell the story for you. The methods section is rather mechanical, but you describe the experiments or techniques that you used to arrive at the results. Spend some time writing the introduction, where you introduce concepts of your paper to the readers, but it's the discussion section where you synthesize everything, bringing it all together so that at the end you allow the results section to provide you an opportunity to tell the readers what it is that you discovered in your study that is novel and interesting. After you've done all of this, sit down to write the abstract. The abstract is extremely important because it's your opportunity to catch the attention of the reviewers and the readers. You may have other materials to bring to bear, and then finally, the title. Spend time thinking about a title that represents your work to the best level possible. I would also like to encourage you to spend time optimizing your figures. From these archival images taken from the Journal of Neurosurgery, you can see how nicely and clearly the data are presented. And these aspects of manuscript submission are extremely important. Make your data as clear and concise as possible. Also spend time thinking about how you're going to present your data. So for example, in this bar graph where you have numeric values on the y-axis and you have years on the x-axis representing various drugs over time, it's somewhat hard to understand what the trends are between the different drugs. But if you were to convert this to a line graph, what you will see is that drug D is diminishing in numeric value over time, and it's not so easy to see that from the bar graph data. So while the bar graph data may look more impressive in terms of visual appeal, in fact the data are easily understood with the line graph on the right. Now, a bit about titles. In general, for the Journal of Neurosurgery, declarative titles are not allowed. So for example, if you wanted to use a title like "The gene for KLF4 causes glioblastoma in athymic mice," that will likely be arranged to the following. The gene for KLF4 is associated with glioblastoma formation in athymic mice. Now, back to the abstract. The abstract can make or break your submission. Most reviewers and readers of your work will read your abstract first, so you should encourage them and entice them to open the other pages of your work. Accordingly, every word should count in your abstract, and there should not be any extraneous words used in this abstract. Well, what are some of the reasons why papers are rejected from the Journal of Neurosurgery? There could be too many used words, or let's start this over. So what are the top reasons why papers are rejected from the Journal of Neurosurgery? There may be verbosity, or contrariwise, not enough information presented. The purpose may be unclear. There may be confusing structure or poor writing within the pages of the manuscript. There may be poor data presentation. Inappropriate statistical methods may have been used. Perhaps the most common reason why manuscripts are rejected is because the conclusions are not supported by the data. Your manuscript, while well written, may lack sufficient novelty to be published, or you may not be using enough references given the importance of the topic you are studying, or there may be too many references used. So try to use just the right number of references for the work you are writing on. Well, I'm a firm believer in the adage, less is more. In this quotation, those who have the most to say usually say it with the fewest words. I think all reviewers on editorial boards welcome economy of words when it comes to manuscript writing, so please try to say what you have to say with the fewest number of words possible. Well, when tackling manuscript revisions, what are some of the principles? Well, one thing to consider is whether you should resubmit your work to the same journal. If the reviewers are asking for an incredible number of revisions, it may be worth your while not to revise and send back to the journal, but rather think about another journal. You can contact the editor-in-chief if you have unresolved issues. But what you should do is prioritize the reviewer's comments. But don't treat the reviewer as an adversary. You can disagree with the reviewer without being disagreeable. You should do the work, or at least most of it, that is being asked of you by the reviewers, and wherever possible, shorten your manuscript. Sometimes you will spend as much time revising a manuscript as you did with the original submission. In any case, it's not just what you say, but it's how you say it. Here's some quotations. We have carefully considered the comments of the reviewers and would like to respond to them point by point as follows. In quotations, thank you for pointing out that we have mislabeled figure 3C. We have now corrected this on the figure itself. Reviewer 3 has suggested we shorten our discussion. Accordingly, we have removed paragraphs 4 through 6 on page 12. And finally, the reviewer has asked us to establish a new mouse model of cancer. While we agree this would be an interesting experiment, it is beyond the scope of our current study. So again, it's not what you say, it's how you say, it's the wording that you bring to bear that will allow the reviewer, upon the revision, to know that you've done the work and you've done it in a conciliatory fashion for the most part. Finally, you might wish to conclude at the end of your revision with your cover letter. We would like to take this opportunity to thank the reviewers once again for their careful review of our study by attending to their many helpful suggestions. We believe that our manuscript has been improved significantly. Well, if your manuscript is rejected, what course of action should you take? First, what do you do if you think your study was poorly reviewed? Well, you can call or write to the editor-in-chief. You should, however, describe how the peer review process was faulty or inadequate. You should state precisely how the reviewers missed the point. You should prepare rebuttals to each of the reviewers' comments, and in the end, you may be invited to resubmit. At least it's worth a try in some instances. However, it's the weight of opinions of the editorial board members that makes the most difference, even when finally discussing your case with the editor-in-chief. Well, here are some things not to do. Of course, scientific misconduct is not allowed. And by that I mean gift authorship, where authorship is granted to authors who did not provide much in the way of input to the study. Redundant publication, where information from prior publications is brought forward in the current submission. Plagiarism, which nowadays can be detected very readily with the use of software programs like Authenticate. Fabrication, where data is made up, is not allowed. Falsifying data represents as well scientific misconduct. And finally, if you have a conflict of interest, this should be disclosed at the front so that everybody is aware of the possible implications of this conflict with the submission of your manuscript. Well, we are indeed very proud of the Journal of Neurosurgery and its rich heritage and its legacy. We know you have many journals to which you can submit your work, but at the outset I would like to thank you once again for considering one of the print or online journals for the Journal of Neurosurgery Publishing Group. And finally, I would like to thank the staff in Charlottesville. Let's start this again. And finally, I would like to thank the staff in Charlottesville. Here we have some 21 dedicated and devoted individuals working tirelessly to make your manuscripts look as professional and accurate and important as possible. I do hope that the comments from this webinar have been helpful to you as you go about submitting your work to the Journal of Neurosurgery. I thank you once again for your attention.
All right. Ahmed, are you still on the line?
Thank you, Professor. It's really a great talk and great tips to get your paper published in a well-respected and organized journal. We will open the floor now for question. We have more than 17 person would like to hear from any one of them. Just you can type your question in the chat, or you can type your question in the question and answer, and we'll discuss it directly with the professor. So we have a question from Dr. Angelos from Cambridge. What does Prof. Rutka think about altmetric?
Oh, okay. Well, thank you, Angelos. So altmetrics, it's a method by which social media, as I understand it, can be used or evaluated in terms of the outreach and the impact of a given journal. And the former director of the social media team of the Journal of Neurosurgery, Naif El-Taibi, was really big on altmetrics and trying to determine where we fit, the Journal of Neurosurgery fit in the world of scientific manuscripts and social media outreach. And I think it's a good thing. And I'm waiting for the day when the altmetrics will influence the impact factor. I think that day is actually coming, but it's not quite there yet in terms of us being able to trace it and verify that, you know, people latch onto social media. They then, you know, read the article in question that is raised through the social media channels, and then they go to the site, and then they incorporate the information from the journal article, and then they embed it in a manuscript that they're writing, so that the work that was sent out initially on social media is cited. That's really essentially how the impact factor will change. And I think that day's coming. I really think that it's not too far away for us to really appreciate that altmetrics will predict for an improvement in things like the impact factor or the citation index for a variety of scientific manuscripts. So, and I'm really pleased to see how we've done in our journal, and I know other journals follow the altmetrics very closely as well.
Very good. And we have another question coming from Fatima. What do you consider a prolonged reviewing period after a manuscript is submitted, and at which point the author should take action about contacting the journal?
Yeah, this is a really good question, is the length of time of manuscript review. And so I'll just hearken back to a statement I made earlier in this presentation, and that is, remember that the reviewers are doing this pro bono. They're not getting paid for this, and so they're doing it based on the time that they have available. If they're on an editorial board, they've already made the agreement that they're going to review in a timely fashion. But there are also a lot of ad hoc reviewers whose schedules you can't predict for. And so a manuscript might get stuck in a system and not get reviewed in a timely manner. But I would say, on average, a reasonable time for review should be under 3 months. So if you're over 3 months and you haven't heard a word about your article in a journal, I think that's a good reason to go to the journal, to the editorial staff, and try to figure it out. Between 2 and 3 months, it's maybe worthwhile investigating it, but just allow for 1 month or 2 months for the clinical journals like Journal of Neurosurgery, like Neurosurgery, Active Neurosurgical, other journals in our space in neurosurgery, because it sometimes will take about 2 months before you get some information from the journal about how your manuscript is doing. I'm very proud now that our journal, we just reviewed our statistics today at a staff meeting that we had, and many of our articles are being reviewed, and the word is getting back to the authors in terms of whether the manuscript's accepted or rejected within 30 days. So that's pretty fast. I'm really happy with that. Of course, it's not a perfect world, and not every manuscript follows that equation, but we're trying to knock down our time to review as much as possible, because we think it's fair for the authors, and then they can submit to another journal if their manuscript happens to be rejected in a timely fashion.
Very good. One of the questions from Jihad Ahmed is, if someone's looking for a research question and developing that, do you have recommendations of how they can get ideas of what needs to be studied?
Yeah, thanks, Jihad. So that's a very good question about how to develop a research question. If you are a young neurosurgeon, if you're a resident, you may want to latch onto a mentor to try to help you determine what might be a good clinical research question or a basic science question. If you're working in a laboratory at this stage in your career and you have research opportunities, again, you'll be following the pathway that your research supervisor is leading, and hopefully coming up with good research-oriented questions. But for a clinical, let's say a clinical question that you might have about, you know, a condition or a case series, it's always good to have a mentor, somebody in your midst, somebody in your program, somebody at the hospital who's quite familiar with what is likely novel, what could be put together as a research paper, and what could be submitted in terms of publication. So, you know, find a good mentor, find a big group to work with where there's lots of clinical materials to draw from, and then to make a decision about what might be the most interesting aspect of that particular question to follow.
All right. There are many different types and styles of research, so from basic science to clinical, as well as randomized control trials, observational studies, case reports. Does JNS have a bias or preference for a particular type of those studies?
As mentioned in our submission to our submission site, so instructions to authors, we spell out what's required for each of these submissions. We have no preference, but we are interested in the best scientific manuscripts, the best papers, the best clinical paper, best case reports. We'll take anything that's really well written and is novel. So I think all journals would like to publish those double-blinded, randomized controlled trials because, as you know, they have the highest impact. Those take years and years to develop and also to put together in the form of a manuscript for consideration of publication. So you may want to start smaller. I encourage residents and trainees to think about writing a case report at first. But remember, a case report has to have some novel aspect to it, but it gives you the building blocks step by step to put into place in order to then acquire the skills to do a systematic review, meta-analysis, large clinical trial, and then maybe a prospective or a randomized trial later on. But we have no particular preference, but the bar is high for each one of those submissions to the Journal of Neurosurgery, but we encourage all of those.
There are a few questions coming in as follow-ups about novelty. To try to pull from them and summarize, it seems like there's a question about something novel versus demonstrating reproducibility in another institution or setting. Can you speak to that? If a study's been done at one center and it's reproduced at another, is there still value to that?
That's a really good question. And if you're verifying what's already been published in the literature, let's say it was published previously with 50 patients in that clinical series, and then what you do is you're verifying that that's the outcome and that's what the end result's going to be in 200 patients versus 50 patients at a different institution. It's somewhat interesting, but I would say the novelty is not huge in that scenario. And so that particular manuscript may not make it into the journal unless there's some twist on it and some new, that's really granular piece of information that didn't exist in the case series that was 50 patients. But if you have 200 patients, numbers alone don't indicate that it's novel. It can help sometimes, it can verify, but the novelty aspect of it may not be as great to warrant publication, not just in the Journal of Neurosurgery, but other neurosurgical journals as well.
All right. Another question is about how can we improve the representation of papers from low and middle income countries in the top neurosurgical journals?
Yeah, thank you for that question. That's a great question. And my heart goes out to countries that don't have like a big track record of publishing in the major neurosurgical journals because of lack of infrastructure, lack of support, lack of equipment in the hospitals to perform high-level neurosurgical procedures. That said, we have components of our Journal of Neurosurgery, that look very carefully at global neurosurgery. And we've had recent articles submitted to the Journal of Neurosurgery coming from all corners of the world that tell a story about what life is like doing neurosurgery in these low to middle income countries. And so we try to publish them, but they also have to meet the standards of scientific manuscript writing. The English has to be good, and also the flow of the manuscript has to follow our guidelines. That said, there are a lot of other journals where you have an option to publish. For example, a very good journal, I'm very pleased to say, is World Neurosurgery. They have many elements within their submission site that allow for publication of articles from low to middle income countries. So if not the Journal of Neurosurgery, if not Neurosurgery, if not Acta Neurosurgica, it could be a journal like World Neurosurgery. So there are some options for you to publish those works in a very, very good journal like World Neurosurgery.
You commented on, the English has to be good. There are questions about, do you recommend those who are non-English speakers to have it reviewed by an English editing service?
Yeah, either an editing service, but I do appreciate in low to middle income countries that can be expensive, or a native English speaker who's kind of working either in your midst or in the scientific community or in the hospital system, so that the English flows and it is perceived as being good use of English syntax, grammar, and word choice, etc. So I would strongly recommend an editing service if available. If not available, then probably second best is a native English speaker with whom you work in order to try to get those manuscripts in as good shape as possible. But I do have sympathy for those that aren't, whose language is not, native language is not English. And I know how hard it is to try to put a manuscript together if you don't have English as your first language. But there are a lot of assists out there for you, and I would recommend those two that I mentioned.
All right, from Alexander, a friend of mine in the Netherlands. What's your view on the qualities of an ideal peer reviewer? And conversely, what should be avoided when peer reviewing a paper?
Yeah, thank you, Alexander. Great questions. So I have an opportunity to help select for the editorial board members that come on and review papers at the Journal of Neurosurgery. The editorial board members themselves also select, so it's a combination of factors that lead to establishing who's going to review for the Journal of Neurosurgery. But that individual, first of all, has to have some kind of track record with scientific manuscript writing and publishing. So at a minimum, should have demonstrated an ability to publish a decent number of papers. I'm not going to put a limit on it, but should have evidence of having published previously, so that we understand that they know what it takes to publish in the different journals. And that editorial board reviewer should be timely. So in other words, getting the manuscript back into the system in a very timely fashion. Should try not to have any biases. It should try to eliminate bias from the reviews, and should try to be fair. I think those would be the qualities that I would say are going to be beneficial for that particular reviewer, and by that, those comments are going to then help the author to make the manuscript better, either for revision at the same journal or for submission and repackaging to be served to another journal.
We have a few med students who are inquiring about advice on kind of the level of research they're getting involved in. So what advice do you have for medical students trying to publish papers or garner research?
Yeah, I think if you're in a system and you're doing research in a laboratory setting, so basic science setting at your institutions, perhaps in Europe or North America, elsewhere, maybe in Asia, then I think that's a really good place to start. Start small, grab onto a project. You may just be a middle author on the first contribution that comes out, because to do science these days, to publish a research paper is actually quite challenging. It takes several months, if not a year or more, to produce a scientific manuscript. As a medical student, I know across North America, there are MD, PhD programs where you are going to be embedded in the lab for many years, in addition to training as a future physician. So you may have time to put together decent scientific papers and be the first author on those types of papers. But for medical students, if you're asking questions too about, how do I improve my chances to get into a neurosurgical program, then it does look good to have papers on your CV that are done with other neurosurgeons or in laboratories where neurosurgical research is being conducted. So I would encourage you to get involved in those types of programs where you can demonstrate a past interest in neurosurgery, because that'll help you in your application to a neurosurgery program wherever you are.
All right. Are there additional questions?
Thank you, Professor. There is some question in the question part. For example, given the increase of presence of academic in a social media platform, what's your opinion to enhance the abstract, for example, visual abstract with regard to augmenting the dissemination of research through the media?
Yeah, so if I heard all the question, it was about visual abstract presentations for papers. And there are a number of journals now that are really moving ahead with visual abstract presentations. We haven't gotten quite there ourselves. We've added some things to our abstract section and in brief section, which means, you know, summarizing what is really important about your work. But I actually like those journals where they have visual abstracts. For example, they have a lot of engaging graphics and figures that tell the story of the paper. And when those are sent out online, even on social media, it's easy to want to be attracted to that information and to jump at the site and to go to that particular article. So personally, I think we're going to see more and more of that, and I would be willing to try to improve upon that presence in the Journal of Neurosurgery within our publication system, something I'm thinking about for the months and years ahead.
Is there a research fellowship for a starter is advisable, Professor?
So this question, I think, was, is it doing a research fellowship advisable at first? I think it helps if you're really committed to doing academic neurosurgery, and that's a broad topic unto itself. Then to do a research fellowship to really get in place what it takes to put together papers for publication, to study a particular disease process, a condition in neurosurgery, to get your name on a variety of papers over time because you've identified an area of interest in the research world that's exciting to you. That can play out in a huge way in your clinical practice, your academic practice, and in the way in which that you would make contributions to literature in the future. So I think it's not absolutely essential. There are many examples of individuals who haven't done that, but I would have to say that by and large, those that have had a dedicated research time period during their residency training or afterwards, whether it's a higher degree like a master's or a PhD or a postdoctoral fellowship after you've done your residency, those individuals seem more destined to continue to contribute to the literature than those that perhaps haven't had that sort of intense training.
There's a paper in the JNS recently about that from the Hopkins group about likelihood of staying in academia and continuing to produce and
exactly.
the different degrees associated.
Yeah. And I think it was shown too that if you had a master's degree, it's a step in the right direction.
Correct. I
think with a PhD, I'm not sure they studied it, but with PhD, I think it's probably even more likely.
Yes.
I have last question here. I know it's not related to our webinar today, but it's great to have the answer from one of the leader in the neurosurgery. There's a question from a medical student. There is any advice for a medical student who wants neurosurgery?
Any advice on
wanting to go into neurosurgery?
Yes.
Yeah, so I would say what attracted me to neurosurgery was interest and passion for the specialty area. And if you're a medical student and you're on this webinar and you're interested in neurosurgery, I think that's great. It is, as Faith knows, as you know, Ahmed, it's a very demanding field and specialty, but it's also at the same time extremely rewarding and gratifying. And our ability to intervene in the lives of patients at a time when they really need us and where we can make huge differences in terms of their longevity, their well-being, and their Also, their abilities to contribute to society are probably unparalleled and unlike any other specialty in all of medicine. So that said, it's a difficult field, and you have to be willing to put in the time, energy, and effort to make yourself as good a neurosurgeon as is possible. And but if you do, and if you are passionate about it, I would just say, do it. Go for it. Put your heart and soul behind it. Don't worry about the length of time of training, because that length of time is actually a small amount of time in your life, and what you have to contribute is much longer. And in the end, you'll be doing something that you've always enjoyed, and you'll never feel like it's difficult coming into work each day. And that's exactly how I feel about my job, even though now I have numerous responsibilities in a variety of different areas. I still feel very fortunate that I chose neurosurgery as a specialty, and I would like to encourage all medical students to follow their hearts and do the same thing, and I hope that you'll choose neurosurgery in this regard.
All right. So with that, we're going to wrap up our webinar for today. Thank you again, Dr. Rutka. This has been a phenomenal session. And all of you watching either live or on YouTube, be sure to check out our WFNS, a Young Neurosurgeons Foundation YouTube channel. We'll be doing more of these throughout the year, featuring different individuals. And if you have ideas, you can contact us of topics that you would like to be featured. So with that, we will say goodbye from Charlottesville, and happy belated New Year.